On the morning of June 4, 1942, while the world's attention locked onto an American fleet steaming toward Midway Atoll, a 19-year-old Japanese pilot turned his crippled fighter toward a deserted stretch of Alaska tundra. He would not walk away from the landing. But the machine he left behind, intact and forgotten in a bog for the next 5 weeks, would help break the back of Japanese air power across the entire Pacific. Petty Officer First Class Tadayoshi Koga had launched that morning from the carrier Ryujo to strike Dutch Harbor, a remote American naval base on Alaska's Unalaska Island, a diversion meant to pull American eyes north while the real blow fell at Midway. He flew a Mitsubishi A6M20, the fighter that had ruled the skies from Pearl Harbor to the Philippines for 7 unbroken months. 2 years earlier, an American volunteer flying for China had warned Washington that a Japanese fighter of exactly this performance existed. War Department analysts dismissed the report as an aerodynamic impossibility. By June of 1942, nobody dismissed it anymore. By the time Koga's wheels left the carrier deck, the Zero's reputation bordered on the supernatural. Over Ceylon 2 months earlier, 36 Zeros had met 60 British aircraft and shot down 27 of them for the loss of a single Japanese fighter. American and British pilots had learned, the hard way, that dogfighting a Zero on its own terms was close to suicide. What nobody had managed to learn was exactly why, or exactly how to beat it. 3 times already, the war had handed the Allies a captured Zero, and 3 times something had gone wrong. 9 wrecked Zeros pulled from the wreckage at Pearl Harbor revealed only that the plane carried no armor and no self-sealing fuel tanks, useful, but nothing about how it actually flew in a fight. A Zero downed over northern Australia was too badly damaged to ever fly again. A recovery team in New Guinea accidentally severed the wing spars of another while trying to move it, ruining it beyond repair. A 4th, painstakingly rebuilt piece by piece in China, would not reach American hands until long after Akutan was already old news. Whatever this new wreck in the Alaska bog turned out to be, it would have to do what 3 earlier wrecks could not. None of it would change the outcome of the larger battle to come. American codebreakers had spent weeks reading Japanese naval signals, and Admiral Chester Nimitz already knew the real blow was aimed at Midway, not Alaska. The raid on Dutch Harbor on June 3 and 4 left 43 Americans dead and 50 wounded, destroyed 14 aircraft and a barracks ship, and fooled exactly no one who mattered. By any measure the men who planned it could have understood, it accomplished nothing. It would still turn out to be the single most consequential air raid of the entire Midway campaign, for a reason nobody on either side saw coming. During that same raid, Koga's 3-plane section is believed to have shot down an American patrol plane and machine-gunned its survivors in the water, killing the pilot and all 6 of his crew, a brutal reminder that this was no abstract contest of machines. Minutes later, ground fire from Dutch Harbor's defenses caught Koga's own Zero and severed an oil line. He turned for Akutan Island, 25 miles east, a stretch of grass marked on Japanese charts as an emergency strip, with a submarine waiting offshore to retrieve downed pilots. His wingmen that day, Chief Petty Officer Makoto Endo and Petty Officer Tsuguo Shikata, circled with him as they searched for somewhere to put him down. From the air, the grassy flat looked solid. On a second pass, Shikata noticed water glistening beneath the grass and realized Koga needed to belly land, skimming across the surface instead of risking his wheels. He tried to signal the warning. It came too late. Koga had already lowered his landing gear and was committed to the approach. The instant his wheels touched down, they caught in the hidden bog, and the Zero flipped onto its back in a single violent motion. Koga died on impact. His 2 wingmen circled, unable to tell whether he had survived, and flew on, leaving the wreck exactly as it lay. Offshore, the waiting submarine searched the coastline for him in vain before an American destroyer drove it off. The crash site sat out of sight of any normal flight path, invisible from the sea. For more than a month, no one came. The Aleutian Islands were notorious among aviators for some of the worst flying weather on Earth, fog, wind, and sudden whiteouts that had already claimed aircraft with no enemy involved at all. It was that same weather, ironically, that finally gave the wreck away. On July 10, the same week headlines around the world were consumed by the climax at Midway. A U.S. Navy PBY Catalina got lost in fog while trying to find its way back to Dutch Harbor. Correcting course over the Shumagan Islands, the crew turned for the most direct line home, straight over Akutan. Below them, a crewman spotted something pale and broken lying in the grass. Lieutenant William Thies circled the wreck, marked its position, and flew back to make his report. What he had stumbled onto, still unconfirmed, was exactly what American intelligence officers had been hunting for since Pearl Harbor, an intact Japanese Zero. Thies convinced his commanding officer to let him return with a salvage team, and what they found stunned them. Flipped onto its back, half buried in mud, the Zero was almost completely undamaged. A Navy photographer documented every angle while the smallest man on the crew, machinist's mate Albert Knack, crawled up inside the inverted cockpit and cut Koga's body free with a knife. The team searched the wreckage for anything of intelligence value, then buried the pilot in a shallow grave near the crash site. Recovering the airplane itself proved far harder. A second team returned the next day to give Koga a proper burial, but their delivery ship had lost 2 anchors and they had no way to unload the heavy equipment needed to free the Zero from the bog. Only on a third attempt, 4 days later, with winches and proper gear finally ashore, did the Navy haul the fighter free of the mud and onto a barge, careful not to inflict any further damage on a machine that, by then, every man on Akutan understood might be priceless. The wreck crossed the Pacific by ship and barge, arriving at Naval Air Station North Island near San Diego in early August. Mechanics worked under round-the-clock armed guard, less to protect a national treasure than to keep souvenir hunters from stripping it for parts. They straightened the tail, the wingtips, the flaps and the canopy, rebuilt the sheared landing gear, and refitted the original 3-blade propeller. By September 20th, 3.5 months after Koga's death, the aircraft was airworthy again, its red Hinomara roundels repainted with American stars. The Imperial Navy's most feared fighter now wore the insignia of the country it had spent 7 months humiliating. That afternoon, Lieutenant Commander Eddie R. Sanders climbed into the cockpit of the very airplane that had outflown every fighter the Allies had thrown at it. He took off, and within minutes, he had found something the entire Pacific Fleet had been hunting for. Sanders later wrote that his very first flight exposed flaws his own pilots could turn directly into an advantage. Above roughly 200 knots, the Zero's ailerons froze stiff, making it almost impossible to roll quickly at speed. It turned left far more easily than right. And its old-fashioned float carburetor choked and cut the engine dead the instant a pilot pushed into a hard dive. For 7 months, American pilots had been told the Zero could outturn, outclimb, and outdive anything in the sky. It could do the first 2. The third, it turned out, was a flaw its engineers had never managed to fix. Sanders had found 2 precise weaknesses, and together they pointed to one answer. A pilot being chased by a Zero no longer had to outturn it, which was impossible, or outclimb it, which was nearly as bad. He could nose over into a steep dive, starve the Zero's engine for a few critical seconds, then roll hard to the right before the Japanese pilot could line up another shot. It was a small, precise piece of knowledge, written down in a test pilot's report on a runway in California, and within weeks it was flowing into briefings for pilots already fighting and dying over Guadalcanal and the Solomon Islands that same autumn. The findings did not stay informal for long. Within weeks, Sanders' results were folded into classified intelligence bulletins with names like Informational Intelligence Summary 59 and Technical Aviation Intelligence Brief No. 3, and distributed to fighter squadrons across the Pacific. One bulletin covering the Zero's general flight characteristics had actually gone out even before Sanders ever took off in it, a quiet reminder that combat pilots and intelligence officers had already pieced together much of the puzzle the hard way, simply by surviving enough encounters to compare notes. The work did not end with Sanders, and the airplane's career was far from over. Later in 1943, it went on public display at Washington's National Airport as a captured war trophy, proof for ordinary Americans that the legendary Zero could be beaten, even tamed. Around the same time, it was transferred to Anacostia Naval Air Station near Washington and flown onto a Naka wind tunnel in Virginia for secret aerodynamic testing. Once back in the air, Frederick Trapnell, the Navy's chief test pilot, flew it through maneuver after maneuver while Sanders flew an American fighter beside him, charting exactly where each plane held the advantage. By 1944, with its intelligence value largely spent, the Zero was reassigned once more, this time to San Diego as a training aircraft, so that rookie pilots bound for the Pacific could study, from the cockpit of a genuine enemy fighter, exactly what they would soon be flying against. A second captured Zero, a newer model taken during the liberation of Guam, eventually joined it in that role. Data from the original flight tests went to the Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics and to Grumman, whose new carrier fighter, the F-6F Hellcat, had already taken its first test flight before the Akutan Zero ever flew again. The captured plane's tests did not redesign the Hellcat's airframe. What they confirmed, in hard numbers, was exactly how the Zero handled at speed and in a dive, knowledge that flowed straight into the cockpits of the pilots who would fly it. 2 years later, in a single afternoon over the Mariana Islands that American pilots nicknamed the Turkey Shoot, Hellcat squadrons would shoot down several hundred Japanese aircraft while losing barely 24 of their own, the kind of one-sided outcome that, back in the summer of 1942, would have sounded like fantasy. By war's end, Hellcat squadrons had destroyed more than 5,000 Japanese aircraft for a kill ratio near 19-1. How much of that success belongs to one wrecked airplane in an Alaska bog is a question historians still argue. The naval officer who commanded the patrol squadron that found it, James Sergeant Russell, called the discovery of tremendous historical significance. Fellow aviator William N. Leonard went further, calling the captured Zero a treasure. In his long career in naval aviation, he said, he never saw another piece of captured enemy equipment give up so much at a moment the fleet needed it more. But other historians point out that combat pilots fighting over Coral Sea, Midway, and Guadalcanal were already working out the Zero's weaknesses for themselves, the hard way, before Sanders ever climbed into the cockpit. The truth, as usual, sits somewhere between legend and footnote, not the single key that unlocked the war, but powerful, hard confirmation of lessons pilots were already paying for in blood. From the other side of the war, one assessment stands largely unchallenged. Masatake Okumiya, a Japanese naval officer who later became one of his country's leading military historians, judged that losing the single airplane to the Americans did much to hasten Japan's final defeat, a verdict from a man with every reason to minimize it, suggesting the wreck in the bog mattered more than anyone in Tokyo wanted to admit. The Akutan Zero itself survived less than 3 more years. In February 1945, while taxiing for takeoff at the same San Diego Air Station, it was struck and sliced apart by a runaway aircraft's spinning propeller, destroyed, in the end, by an accident rather than an enemy. Pieces of it are preserved today in American museums. Tadayoshi Koga's body fared worse. In 1988, an American writer and a Japanese businessman tried to locate and bring his remains home. They found his original grave empty. Records eventually showed that an American graves unit, not realizing whose body it was, had exhumed Koga in 1947 and reburied him, unidentified, on a different island down the Aleutian chain. When that cemetery was excavated in 1953 and its unidentified remains sent home for cremation, Koga most likely returned to Japan anonymously, among hundreds of unknown dead, to a national cemetery in Tokyo with neither his rank nor his name attached to the journey. A 19-year-old pilot died trying to bring his squadron's most advanced secret safely home. Instead, his wrecked airplane delivered that secret to the men he had been trying to kill, quietly, patiently, through a bog, a barge, a San Diego hangar, and 24 test flights, and very possibly, in the years of air combat still ahead, helped some of them come home alive. It is not the kind of victory either side could have planned for, and it cost more than the war ever properly counted.